Om yo brahmanam vidadhati purvam yo vai vedangscha prahinoti tasmai tam hadevam atmabuddhi prakasham mumukshurvai sharanamaham prapadye. We who seek liberation take refuge in that infinite light which illumines the hearts of all, who is the source of the Creator himself, and who delivered, or who is the source of the infinite knowledge, Veda. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. Now, that particular chant is not really appropriate for beginning a lecture on yoga. Because though yoga, and even the Buddhists, yoga and Sankhya philosophy, and even the Buddhists, they accept the Vedic gods. Many people felt that, well, the Buddha, he denied God. Well, he denied one God, who is a creator God, but he accepted Indra, Brahma, and all of the others. In fact, they came to praise him after he had attained enlightenment. And yoga accepts the idea of God, but the idea of a God in a special sense, not the idea of God as a creator God. But one of the greatnesses of Hinduism, and of the Vedanta tradition within Hinduism in particular, is its power to assimilate, to absorb. And so that's why Swami Vivekananda used to say that nowadays, to be a Hindu is to be some form of Vedantin. Vedanta was one of 6 systems of orthodox Hindu philosophy, and there were some other schools also, that different tantric schools and Kashmir Shaivism, but 6 main schools of orthodox Hindu philosophy. But what happened over the centuries was that the Vedanta absorbed the contributions of the other schools. The positive contributions. And so nowadays, if someone says, I am a follower of yoga, what they generally mean is, with rare exceptions, what they generally mean is, well, of course I'm a Vedantin, but my specialty is yoga. Or if they say that I'm a specialist in Nyaya, the school of logic, which was a separate school of philosophy, what they generally mean is, well, of course I accept the Vedanta, but I specialize in Nyaya, or Purva Mimamsa, or Sankhya philosophy, etc. And so, though I will point to differences between yoga philosophy and Vedanta on occasion where it's pertinent in understanding the message of yoga, I'm not going to teach it as a separate philosophy, separate and distinct, and in some places contradictory to the Vedanta, because we hear nowadays many speak of Yoga Vedanta, and so I'm going to speak more of Yoga Vedanta from Patanjali's standpoint, and again, where it's pertinent, I'll speak of the distinctions between yoga and Vedanta, but I'm not going to dwell on the distinctions, because yoga has become a system of practice that is used by Vedantins, just as the Sankhya philosophy, which yoga is based on. There are distinctions between yoga and Sankhya also. That's why they're 2 distinct schools of philosophy, but they're very close. They share far, far more than their distinctions. But the Sankhya philosophy, another separate school of philosophy, its cosmology was largely absorbed into Vedanta. And the practices of yoga were largely absorbed into the Vedanta. So, let me say, this session I'm going to speak largely in introduction to the topic of yoga. And I will get into the first 4 sutras, which are the essence of the whole system of yoga. But I want to begin by giving some historical and philosophical context. But everything in this retreat is to be practice-oriented, and so this also will be the historical and philosophical context, which is necessary in order to understand yoga from a practical standpoint. So first let me say a word about Raja Yoga, as it's called by Swami Vivekananda. He took the term from the Tantric system, where Raja Yoga was that yoga which dealt with the mind, that yoga of meditation. And so the Swami Vivekananda applied that to the path of meditation, the path of psychic control, the path of mental control. And he made the foundation of it, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So, how does yoga, the path of yoga, Raja Yoga, which is also most often shortened to yoga, how does it differ from the other three yogas? The path of knowledge, the path of devotion, the path of work, the path of activity, the path of karma. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, and Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, they are primarily concerned with the nature of reality. What is the nature of reality? If you follow the path of Bhakti, the path of devotion, you are following a path that is oriented towards God as the supreme reality. And you're seeking God as the supreme reality. That's what defines Bhakti, is the goal. In Jnana Yoga, as Swami Sarvapriyanandaji explained, in Jnana Yoga you are seeking to know who you are, what you are, as he very aptly explained. Not who as a person, but what am I? What is my reality? Who am I really? What am I really? And so it's oriented towards the reality of my own being. That's where the path of Jnana Yoga gets its whole orientation. What am I seeking? I'm seeking to know who I am. Bhakti Yoga, what am I seeking? I'm seeking to know God, to realize God. Both are goal-oriented, reality-oriented. But Raja Yoga and Karma Yoga are distinguished by the fact that they are process-oriented. They're not reality-oriented. You can follow Karma Yoga from this devotional standpoint or from the impersonal self-knowledge standpoint, or purely as a technique. Raja Yoga you can practice from the standpoint of devotion, like the great Pauhari Baba that Swami Vivekananda used to speak of as the greatest person he had ever met after Sri Ramakrishna. He was a bhakta, but a Raja Yogi. Or you can follow Raja Yoga from the impersonal standpoint, seeking self-knowledge from the standpoint, because it doesn't care how you conceive of reality. What it cares of is the process, the practice. So in the Yoga Sutras, you'll see that he talks about Ishvara Pranidhana, surrender to God. And he also speaks about knowing the self, which he calls the Purusha, but which we in Vedanta most often call the Atman, as you know. And so Raja Yoga is distinguished as a process-oriented path, process-oriented, and that's important, and that will come up again in what I see in these introductory remarks. Next thing I want to say in introduction is a word about Kapila Muni. Muni just means sage, and so he's often called Kapila Muni, the sage Kapila. As Swami Vivekananda said, he was the first philosopher. He was the first philosopher, and Swami Vivekananda felt, there's no historical proof of this yet, but Swami Vivekananda felt that Kapila was the world's first philosopher, long before the awakening of Greek philosophy. What makes philosophy philosophy? What distinguishes philosophy? What distinguishes it is that philosophy approaches understanding what it is that we experience from the standpoint of principle. Most religions have stories to tell. Stories to tell about creation and about salvation and a great teacher and who he was and what he did and why we should believe in the teacher and follow his teachings and so forth. They're story-oriented. But philosophy doesn't tell stories. Philosophy looks at this and says, what is this? Not who made it and what are the gods and the demons and their struggles and how things came to be because the demons and the gods were fighting with each other and they churned the ocean of nectar and things came out of it and so forth. No. What is this? What is this? What is this? What is this? What is my mind? What is my consciousness? What is reality? What is existence? So philosophy is interested in principle, not in story. You can tell all sorts of stories that have philosophical import, but they're interested in the philosophical import. And so Kapila was the first philosopher, according to Swami Vivekananda. And one of his greatest discovery, I should say, his greatest discovery was the nature of consciousness. The nature of consciousness. In the West, even today, if you talk about consciousness from a Western standpoint, not Westerners like some of us who have studied Vedanta, but consciousness from a Western standpoint, what are you speaking about? You're speaking about conscious mental processes. Conscious mental processes. The West never developed the idea that consciousness is a reality in itself. It's not a process. From the standpoint developed first by Kapila, and that which Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, is also developed from, because Kapila is the first philosopher. All of philosophy that developed later in India is dependent on certain insights of Kapila, and certainly Vedanta is heavily dependent on certain insights of Kapila. So Kapila discovered that consciousness is a reality in itself. It's the light of awareness itself. It's the light through which all experience takes place. But it's a light which stands on its own, which can stand on its own, and which should stand on its own. A light which is the infinite light of infinite knowledge, not knowledge in the sense of knowing things, as Swami Atmarupananda explained in his talk, not knowing things, but just infinite awareness, infinite knowledge. That is the light which illumines our minds. And what in the West we call consciousness is that part of the mind which is illumined by consciousness, that part of the mind which is operating that we're aware of. I'm aware that I'm thinking, I'm aware that I'm talking. That's because consciousness is illumining those processes within the mind and the awareness of my body and so forth. But consciousness stands by itself. And so Kapila was the first to understand consciousness itself and to make that the starting point of his philosophy and to distinguish that from everything else. All of this that we see is an object of consciousness. I see you how? Through the light of consciousness. It's the light of consciousness that illumines you. How do I see the sun? Because the sun illumines me? No, I illumine the sun. I illumine the sun. I illumine the moon. I illumine the stars. How? I open my eyes and say, "Oh sun, you exist." Without my consciousness, for me, the sun has no existence. It's because my consciousness illumines the presence of the sun. I illumine the sun. The sun doesn't illumine me. Yes, the sun's light, physical light, illumines this body. But I illumine the presence of the sun. And so everything physical is an object of consciousness. Everything mental is an object of consciousness. All of my thoughts. I can observe my thoughts. And through spiritual practice, what we call the unconscious mind, gradually more and more of that comes into the field of consciousness, which means it's no longer the unconscious mind. More and more of it becomes part of the conscious mind. And it's my consciousness which illumines my thoughts. I can be aware of my thoughts. Why? Because I'm the light of experience, and the thoughts are among the objects of my experience. I can be aware of my emotions. That means the emotions are objects of my experience. Thoughts are objects of my experience. This whole world is an object of my experience. So Kapila was the first great sage who understood that distinction between consciousness and everything else. So, and then as a philosopher, he developed a cosmology, how it was that this universe came into being. And there he developed that from the standpoint of philosophy as well. Not who made it and how did they make it and what did they make it out of and how many days did it take for God to create the universe and what did he do on the first day and how long did he rest on the seventh day and things like that. No, it was from the standpoint of principle. What is this and how did this come to be? If consciousness is the reality, what is the root of all of this? And that he came up with, prakriti, nature. So when you see in Swami Vivekananda where he talks about it's not man for nature, it's nature for man, meaning man in its generic sense, of course. That to the Western ear sounds very regressive and very bad. No, it's because we don't live in harmony with nature that all of our problems are there. Well, no, Swamiji is not talking of nature in the Western sense. And the Western sense of nature is everything that's not touched by human beings. That's nature. And somehow everything that is human and has been touched by humans is unnatural. No, nature in this sense, prakriti, is everything. Everything. Anything that can be observed, anything that can be seen as an object, including all of my thoughts, my mind, the unconscious mind, which can also be eventually made conscious, all of that is matter. So matter, Prakriti, Kapila, he discovered that, that this whole universe, that it can go back into a seed state, a causal state, and out of that the universe proceeds. And so he developed a cosmology which Vedanta accepted also. Now I'm not going to talk more about that. This is not going to be a talk on cosmology and other such philosophical items, because we want this retreat to be more practice-oriented, but it is necessary to know this as context. So his influence, he's looked upon as the father of Sankhya philosophy, but he was much more than that. He was not just the father of Sankhya philosophy. It was his insights also that influenced the whole development of the Vedanta philosophy in all of its aspects. The yoga philosophy also is based on the insights of Kapila. The path of Jnana Yoga is based on the insights of Kapila. Again, Advaita Vedanta refined the Sankhya philosophy and found that there were certain ultimate flaws in the philosophy. That is, if you resolve the whole of our experience into the perceiver, I am the perceiver, I'm the one who sees, and everything that's perceived, including this mind and body, that can't be me because I see the body. I see my mind, I see my thoughts. That can't be me because I see it, just as I see you. That can't be me. But Kapila resolved that difference between the perceiver and the perceived into these two principles. The Upanishads discovered, the sages of the Upanishads discovered, because Kapila was before the Upanishads. He's mentioned in the Upanishads. Kapila discovered, the Upanishadic seers discovered that there's not this ultimate duality between the perceiver and the perceived. That's excellent for practice, and it's true to our experience right now, our relative experience. But ultimately we find that where did Prakriti come from? Does it have a separate existence? No, it doesn't have a separate existence. Prakriti is just appearance. It's just appearance, and only consciousness remains. For practice, it's an excellent practice to distinguish between consciousness and everything else, to know what consciousness itself is. But a time comes, as Sri Ramakrishna showed and many others have shown, a time comes when we see Prakriti itself, everything within nature, as just a wave, a modification of consciousness. Just a modification of consciousness, just an appearance of consciousness. So now that, if that doesn't make sense yet, it will one day, and Swami Atmarupananda is here to explain that. So, I turn over the responsibility to him. So again, Kapila was extraordinarily important. Now, let me just mention some basic differences between yoga, Sankhya and yoga, which often go together because they're so close as philosophies, and the non-dualistic Vedanta. One I just mentioned, and that is that Vedanta doesn't believe in an ultimate dualism, where there is matter which is real and eternal and objective, and it's there. It's the real stuff out of which this universe has come. Again, not matter in the modern scientific sense. Not matter in the sense of the periodic table of chemical elements. Vedanta and yoga are not foolish enough to try to deny the periodic table of chemical elements, but they say that that's just the most externalized form of matter. Matter can be traced back to more and more subtle principles until you get to Prakriti. But Vedanta doesn't end there with that ultimate dualism between consciousness and everything which is objective, which can be perceived objectively. It says that there's an ultimate non-dual reality. That's where we get Advaita from, non-dual reality, out of which the split between consciousness and matter comes because of misperception. So that's one difference between Sankhya Yoga and Vedanta. Another is Sankhya doesn't accept, at least Sankhya as it has come down to us. There's a doubt among some scholars about the original Sankhya, whether it had a place for God or not. But Sankhya, as it has come down to us, Sankhya philosophy from the classical age, they didn't accept the idea of God. The gods, yes, but the gods were just like us, but with more power. But they were basically like us. But God as the cosmic reality the personal cosmic reality and director of the universe and source of the universe, etc. No, they don't accept that. Yoga does, but not in the sense that Vedanta accepts God. Yoga has an unusual concept of God. It accepts the reality of God as the repository of infinite knowledge. Sarvagnya Bijam is the seed of all-knowingness. I won't go into this because, again, it will take us far afield and involve us in philosophical distinctions which we don't need to go in now. They are important and they are interesting once you get into them, but again, that's for another retreat. But this idea of God being the repository of infinite knowledge, that there is one soul. In yoga, there's the idea, another idea is that each of us has a separate soul. Each of us is infinite consciousness, but my infinite consciousness is separate from your infinite consciousness, which is separate from her infinite consciousness, separate from his infinite consciousness. So there are an infinite number of infinite consciousnesses, which Vedanta said, well, that if it's infinite and there's more than one infinite, then it's no longer infinite, because your infinity is limited by my infinity. If my infinity excludes you, you, by that fact of exclusion, are not infinite. Neither am I. And so Vedanta again comes to this one non-dual reality, not even one, but non-dual reality. But again, in coming back to God in yoga philosophy, they said that there is one soul who is never obscured by ignorance, and who is the source of all infinite knowledge. And that's a very interesting concept, and I'll just mention what it is I'm not going to talk about now. That is that that idea of the necessity for an infinite repository of all knowledge, of all knowingness. The very existence of knowledge. Well, let me back up and say that we are so, our understanding, our minds are so obscured by modern scientific thinking. Now, science is a great thing. It has made many great discoveries, and it has cleared away many superstitions. But science itself has many severe superstitions of its own. And one of them is that reality is matter, and out of matter everything has come. And matter is dull, dead, and sentient stuff. And so you have to trace the cause of everything back to a material basis. Everything here has bubbled up out of matter. You combine matter in certain ways and you get everything that we see, including consciousness. The ideas of God, that's just a bubbling up of matter within our brains, which are just bubblings of matter. So we're so used to that, being able to trace everything back down to dull, dead, and sentient matter, that the idea that there is existent infinite knowledge, and that the little bits of knowledge that we have are bits of an infinite repository of knowledge. But the yogins realized that no, there has to be, if we know something, if I understand something, I know something, I have a little flash of understanding, there's suddenly a flash of insight. But that's tapping into a little bit of this infinite source of knowledge. And so again, I won't go into the reasons for why they say there has to be an infinite source of knowledge, but once you get into it, you see that it is a very rational idea. So they have the idea of God, just not a God who is a creator God, but God who is infinite knowledge and who is Purvesham api Guru, who is the teacher of even the earliest gurus. Where did the process of understanding come from? How did we come to know anything in any subject? Because there was someone who understood something, and that was passed along from teacher to disciple, whether in the arts, in music, dramatic arts, in mathematics, in astronomy, in yoga, in Vedanta, anything. There is this, someone had to awaken to a truth, and then it had to be passed down. And what was the origin of all knowledges and sciences? That was God, according to the yoga system. So the teacher of all, the all teachers. Now the other differences between Sankhya and Yoga we'll just ignore. They're minor philosophical differences. Important if you're a philosopher. If you're a practitioner, they don't make much difference. And again, I'm going to, though I will point to distinctions when it's pertinent, I'm going to speak really of Yoga Vedanta. Patanjali Yoga Sutras as a system that can work within the Vedanta philosophy. So now let me say a word about the distinction between the path of Raja Yoga and the path of Jnana Yoga, because they're closely related. They're closely related and they work well together. Though, as Swami Vivekananda says, each of the yogas can stand by itself, basically. It can stand on its own legs. It can be approached as a path in itself. But usually we find the yogas mixed together. And we, just as in as they call it, a Venn diagram, you find that the yogas at the edges, they always do blend somewhat. But you can still speak of a particular yoga as an independent yoga, or you can combine them. And so Raja Yoga and Jnana Yoga, the path of yoga, as we're calling it, as I'm calling it now, and the path of knowledge, they can stand alone or they can be very easily blended, and often are blended. The path of yoga can also be blended with the path of devotion, very beautifully as well. As I mentioned, Paul Baba, the great saint, was both a great bhakta and a great yogi. So in the path of knowledge, the essence of the path of knowledge is a change of identity. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm consciousness itself. And so if you're following the path of knowledge without combining the path of Raja Yoga with it, then the essence of it is just changing your identity. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind. I am consciousness itself. I am reality itself. This universe appears where? It appears within me. Where do I see all of you? Inside of me. You say, well, Swami, you're standing over there, we're sitting over here. Come back to earth a little bit. No, I refuse. I don't want to. And I don't need to. Where do I see? First of all, you say, oh, well, Swami, you're over there, you're standing there, and we're sitting way over here, a long ways from you. You can't even reach out and touch us. You'd have to walk over here to touch us. So how can you say we are inside of you? No. Where do I see my own body? Which is what makes you think I'm standing over here. I see my body within myself. I see the body, I perceive it. I perceive it where? Within my own awareness. I perceive my body within my awareness. Where do I perceive you? Within my awareness. Why do I think you're there and I'm here? Because I've identified with the body rather than with awareness. And so I think that this is me, and so I must be standing over here. But why should I think that? Why shouldn't I think that I am awareness itself? The whole universe appears within my awareness. So in Jnana Yoga, you take your stand on, the essence of it is changing your sense of identity. Yes, the process of preparation, which Swami Sarvapriyananji beautifully explained, but that's the preparation so that you can more easily change your sense of identity through practice and again, telling yourself what you are and trying to identify with that. And so, again, in the pure path of Jnana Yoga, as far as possible, you forget about steps. You don't say that one day I'm going, as he said at the beginning of his talk, you don't start out by saying that, well, one day I'm going to become the Atman. Right now I'm this psychophysical being, but I'm going to become the Atman. No. You start out right now, I am pure and perfect right now. I just don't see it. Somehow there's a mistaken perception. I don't see the reality that I am the truth right now. But somehow there's a mistake somewhere. I'm making a mistake. I'm perceiving wrongly. So that as far as possible in the pure path of Jnana Yoga, you dispense with steps. It's not about, well, first you do this, and then you do that, and then you do that. Yes, these are for preparation so that that change of identity is easier. But as far as possible, even when you're doing this, you're also trying to assert your reality here and now. Swamiji says in that quotation that Swami Harinamananda read in the beginning, each soul is potentially divine. No. I'll say Swamiji was wrong. I'll come back and correct my statement about Swamiji being wrong in a moment, of course. But because Swamiji himself knew far better than I do, far better than I do, that no, it's not potential divinity. You are divinity right now. And that's the standpoint of Jnana Yoga. But from the standpoint of yoga, I am potential divinity. I will realize someday my reality. And so many people, when we come to spiritual life, what we want is a recipe for spiritual life. And if you come to somebody who just teaches the path of knowledge, they say, well, there's no recipe. You are the truth. You are reality. And of course, again, as Swami Atmarupananda said, there's some teachers who take that to an extreme and say that there's no process, you just have to realize it, and so just be it. And once you understand it, you're there. That's all that there is, just understand it. Well, no, there's more to it than that. You have to actually perceive it. You have to realize it so that that becomes your reality, not this. It's not just an idea, a conceptual understanding. But that's what you try to realize by affirming it day and night. But in Raja Yoga, it is it's process-oriented. And so Raja Yoga, as far as is possible in spiritual life, gives you a recipe for spiritual life. Now most of us, when we're looking at spiritual life and wanting a recipe, we're used to everything being objective and everything being out there and everything done out there and all value and reality and everything being out there. So when we ask for a recipe, they will, they tell me the things that I do and the thoughts that I should think and the things that I should do in tangible, concrete terms that will turn me into a saint by doing it. Well, no, the recipe is not like that, because the recipe of Raja Yoga starts with some physical practices and moral practices and so forth, but eventually it comes to taking hold of the mind itself. But how do you take hold of the mind itself? I don't even have any hair to grab. And even if I did, I'd just be grabbing hair. I wouldn't be grabbing my mind. So in Raja Yoga, it's controlling the mind by the mind. Control of the mind by the mind. Again, there are physical helps, both asanas and pranayama, which are wonderful physical helps, but eventually you come to the task of controlling the mind by the mind. So Raja Yoga is gives, as far as is possible, a recipe for spiritual life. Do these things, do these observances, and so forth, and you will see the changes yourself in yourself. And so it's practice-oriented. Raja Yoga is practice-oriented. Rather than just affirmation of the highest truth, it's practice-oriented. It's process-oriented. That is, there is a process to it. Begin with this, then do this, and then do this, and then do this. And it is mind-oriented. Mind-oriented. It's the path of the mind. Why is the mind so important in Raja Yoga? What is the mind? What is the mind? We use so many words and think that we know what we're talking about when we use words, but usually we don't know what we're talking about. So something like mind, we think we know what mind is. Were you going to say something, sir?
Quick. Start quick.
Oh, you have to change this? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Is it delivery at the door?
Oh, that's for me. It is. I ordered on Amazon a book on yoga. So that tonight at least I can read something and have something to say tomorrow.
Delivery.
That's all it is? Gosh, I thought it was a 500-page book. That's a disappointment. So, you ready? Yes. Okay. So what is the mind? We think we know what the mind is. We use it all the time, but we don't really know what the mind is. Well, there are a variety of ways of saying what the mind is, but for now, what I will say is, and it is a true way of speaking of the mind is our instrument of experience. How do you know happiness? Through the mind. How do you know sadness? Through the mind. How do you know success? Through the mind. How do you know failure? Through the mind. How do you know pleasure? Through the mind. How do you know pain? Through the mind. Yes, your pain may be in your foot, a long way from what you think your mind is up here, but you know it's in the foot because of the mind. You experience it through the mind. How do I know light? Through the mind. How do I know darkness? Through the mind. Where do I have a vision of God? Within the mind. There is a state beyond the mind, but that's the ultimate state. The very last, once you go beyond the mind, there's nowhere else to go. But until we attain to the very highest state where the mind dissolves, the state of manonasha, as it's called in the Yoga Vasishta, the destruction of the mind. The mind dissolves back into its source. Until then, everything we know through the mind, including everything spiritual that we know, including our spiritual experience, spiritual visions, spiritual intuitions, all of that is known through the mind also. The mind is the instrument of all of our experience, all of our experience. And so, if the mind is not taken care of, what kind of experience can we hope to have? Distorted experience, bad experience. So the yoga is a system of perfecting the mind. And again, why do they want to perfect the mind? Because if the mind is the instrument of experience, it's only in a pure, crystal clear mind that true experience can be had. True knowledge can be had. Knowledge of the truth can be had. There are many analogies, similes, metaphors used for this. And one that's very appropriate here is the surface of a lake. We've all been to lakes in the mountains on an extremely still day. And if we haven't been there, we've seen calendars where there's a picture of a lake and a forest behind the lake and a mountain and a forest in front. And then you see a perfect reflection of the mountain and the forest in the lake. And sometimes, if good filters are used and so forth, and taking of the photography, you can't tell which is the reflection and which is the original, which is the thing that's being reflected. So when the water is perfectly clear, the water is itself pure and it's still, it catches a perfect reflection. And so the mind, when the mind is still and the mind is clear, clarified, purified, then it catches a perfect reflection of reality. That which comes into the mind. And so both yoga and Advaita Vedanta says that there's one more step. Once the mind is perfectly clear and catches a reflection of reality, then the mind itself dissolves and there's only reality left. Because even that is dualistic, where there's a mind catching a reflection of what ultimately we want is not the reflection of reality, we want reality itself. But for us right now, even getting the mind to calm down a little bit and to clarify itself a little bit is a great help in spiritual life, a great help. And so in spiritual life, we always need a proximate goal. The next step I need to take, what do I need to do right now? And then what is the long-term goal? And so the long-term goal is for the mind to become so clear that reality flashes into the mind. And then that flash of reality dissolves the mind itself and reality remains. So you may think that that sounds pretty awful, having the mind disappear. But no, if we could get there, that would be a most blessed state. It's a shame that we have to now operate through the mind. But because we do, because right now it's the instrument of all of our experience, we have to take care of the mind. We have to be careful with the mind, because it's through the mind that we know everything, through the mind that we experience everything, through the mind that we know that we have knowledge, and through the mind that we experience ignorance. So, yoga, Raja Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, is all about the perfection of mind as an instrument. But again, it gives a recipe. So, one of the problems in the path of jnana, and there are problems in every path. So this isn't, it's not that the path of jnana is the path that has problems and other paths don't have problems. No, every path has its peculiar problems and its peculiar virtues. One of the problems in following the path of jnana is that if we follow the path of jnana by itself, which can be done, and which people have done, which people are doing, and which has been done successfully. But the practical problem many people face in following jnana is that the mind is not strong enough to hold on to the truths of jnana yoga. I tell you that you are the reality itself. All you have to know is to know who you are, just to hold on to that sense that I am a reality. Or to hold on to the question, who am I, or what am I, and to go behind everything else until you find that which remains. But who has a mind strong enough to do that? And so, yoga is a process of strengthening the mind, And in another way, it helps in the path of devotion, because in the path of devotion also, the great philosopher of devotion, Ramanujacharya, he said that devotion, bhakti, is a jnana vishesha. It's a special type of knowledge. It's a Vishishta Jnana. It's a special type of knowledge. That love for God is a special type of knowledge. And so if the mind is under control, we find that that knowledge of God and that devotion to God arise more spontaneously. Just as the Swami explained with these, if you have these preparations, the sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold, which is, the Swami beautifully explained, it's a way of sneaking in, say, 6 extra disciplines so that you don't feel quite so bad. If you say you've got to practice 9 disciplines, then people think overwhelmed. But the 4 disciplines, oh, that's easy, I can do the 4 things. So, just as with these, if you follow these, then the path of jnana becomes relatively easy. And so with the control of the mind, then devotion comes more easily, knowledge comes more easily, everything comes more easily. So let me just give the 4 beginning sutras. My time is almost up. But I'll give the 4 beginning sutras in 4 minutes. This is the essence of yoga. The idea is that if you understand these 4 sutras, you've understood the whole of yoga. And the rest of the Yoga Sutras are for those who don't get realization by learning these 4 sutras. So the first is Atha Yoga Anushasanam. Now for the study of yoga. That doesn't feel very enlightening. It's just an introduction. Now for the study of yoga. But now for the study of yoga means that now you have become prepared for the study of yoga. Why? In general, because your life experience has brought you to the point where you want to study yoga. So your life experience has to bring you to a point where you find the insufficiency of ordinary life, and now I'm going to follow yoga in order to attain to reality which will solve once and for all the problem of life. Problems which come down to just the problem of life. So that's the first sutra. Second sutra is Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is, it's defining yoga. Yoga is the cessation of all vrittis, or all modifications of the mind. I'm seeing you. My mind has taken the form of this room. That's how I see all of you. This can be explained even in terms of modern scientific perception. It's true to modern scientific perception as well, but I won't go into that because now I only have about 3 minutes left, or 2.5 minutes. But it can be explained. If somebody wants to ask about it, they can ask about it later. So yoga sthita vritti nirodha. The essence of yoga, what yoga is the cessation of the modifications of the mind. When the alpine lake is perfectly transparent, then it catches a perfect reflection of reality. When the modifications of my mind, the restlessness of my mind, the winds of desires have died down, and the mind has become calm, utterly peaceful, then it catches a reflection of reality. So that is yoga. The state of yoga is that. And the third sutra is Tadadrashtu Swarupe Vastanam. Then the seer, the self, the seer, is established in its own nature, not his, not hers, its own nature, because it's neither he nor she at that point. He and she pertain to the body and to certain lower psychological aspects, but the higher self is completely free from gender. And so then when that happens, when all modifications of the mind stop, then the self is self-revealed because it shines in its own glory. It's the mind, the activity of the mind, which is obscuring everything for us, which is making everything muddy for us, and that's why we see the things they are. So then, at that state of perfection of the mind, then we see the truth. And the fourth sutra is vritti sarupyam itaratra. At other times, there is identity with the modifications of the mind. At other times, when the mind is restless, as our normal mind is all of the time, even when we're sleeping, the mind is active, except in deep sleep, and then we're under the cloud of ignorance. So at other times, when the mind is restless, then we are identified with the modifications of the mind. So we identify with this body, with this mind, with my ideas, my possessions, and so forth. So this is the essence of yoga. That now, once we have matured to a point where we realize that something else in life is necessary, and spiritual life seems to promise that which I need, now I'm ready for the study of yoga. Now, what is yoga? It's the complete cessation of all mental activity, all mental modifications. Let me just add a warning here, which I'll explain more fully in other classes. That doesn't mean that the way to meditate is to make the mind a blank. No, that leads to a dull state of mind. The mind needs something to hold on to make it one-pointed first. But When the mind is still, then the nature of who I am, it flashes forth. I know myself as I am. Because I'm established in my nature. The mind is no longer a veil clouding the nature of reality. But at other times, I suffer because I identify with the modifications of the mind. So, I'll stop here. Time's up. Oh.
Swamiji, you mentioned awareness and consciousness. Is there a difference between the two?
Good question. The question is, I mentioned awareness and consciousness. Is there a difference between the two? Well, they are words, and as words, they can be given different definitions. So sometimes people will give a different definition to the two. I was using them synonymously, awareness and consciousness. Now, awareness, generally, when we talk about awareness, we're talking about awareness of an object. And so it's, and consciousness, when we speak of it, generally we're talking about conscious mental processes, again, in the West. So I'm using both of them in a very specialized sense, where it means the light in itself, by itself, without reference to necessarily without reference to an object. Right now, all of the light of consciousness which I am is in reference to objects, and that's why I confuse objects with consciousness. Why I think the body is conscious, why I think the mind is conscious, no. But as I was using it, I meant them two as the same. There's a question back in?
Can you,
Oh.
testing 1, 2, 3?
Yes.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay.
Here's a close one, and then we'll come back to you. Okay, just because it's close to the
Speak
microphone.
close.
Swamiji, what is the difference between, say, Raja Yoga, the process prescribed there, and in, for example, Drisha Viveka, the Vedantic, the so-called Vedantic meditation?
Very good. So question is, what is the difference between Raja Yoga and knowing the self and distinguishing the self from everything else, and the process in Drishya Viveka? The text, small text, which Swami Atmarupananda has lectures about that text on YouTube, which are very popular. A very good exposition of Drishya Viveka, which teaches the practice of distinguishing between the seer, the experiencer, and everything which is experienced, including this body and mind. So there's really no distinction there. As far as that practice goes, there's no distinction, except that, again, in yoga, the goal is to know oneself as infinite, but not as the infinite. There are many other infinites. And in Advaita, the highest point, the goal is to know that I am the one consciousness, the one non-dual consciousness. So there's nothing out, no other consciousness to be had. So that's only the very highest level. So as a matter of practice, the two are very similar. There's not really a need to make a distinction between the two.
But there is a process there which is Savikalpa Samadhi, Vivekananda Samadhi there. That's a different process that...
Well, yeah, again, you can make refined distinctions. I'm talking about just the practice of Drishya Viveka itself. If you want to point to the way that the path is described, yes, you can find distinctions, but those are not significant distinctions. The practice of distinguishing consciousness from non-consciousness, that's the same in the two. But of course in Raja Yoga, there's the description of different types of samadhi that you go through to attain to realization also. It's just that it's not a one-to-one correspondence with the Vedantic idea. So now here.
With regards to the 4 sutras, in going from the stage of cessation of the vrittis down to the seer establishing their own nature, the question really is that in meditation, in going to that place, sometimes it happens, not every time, and perhaps I'm sleeping, but nevertheless, there is not, I'm aware when I come out of it, but not as I go down. So does the Patanjali Yoga Sutra elucidate more on that in a very aware way of going down to that level, not just in coming up?
Yes. Now, first let me say that yes, oftentimes we do just lapse into sleep and don't know that anything happened. We had a brahmachari when I was in the training center at Belo Math, who, as soon as he sat for meditation in our group meditation, in those days we had a chapel that's gone from the training center now, but a chapel where we all had to sit for meditation every day. He would sit down and his head would fall into his lap and he would snore for 45 minutes. And he would get up and say, oh my God, and he was serious. I had such a wonderful meditation, I wasn't aware of anything. So putting that aside, that's a possibility, of course. But yes, there is, in the Yoga Sutras, they do talk about this a state of absorption, of engrossment, where the awareness is there, but there's not. It's like deep sleep, where awareness is present in deep sleep also. But in deep sleep, there's no object that we're perceiving, and there's also no sense of the separate ego perceiving something. There's no sense of being a seer and something being seen. All that's experienced from the ordinary standpoint is just darkness. And there's no sense of time in deep sleep also. So when we wake up from deep sleep, we say, oh my God, that was wonderful. I didn't know anything. I was just zonked. I have no idea how long I was that way, but I was completely gone. So in a type of meditation also, there's a type of meditation where we go into that meditation, and because there's no, the sense of time is so highly refined that we're not aware of the passage of time. We can be in that state for a fairly long time, and we come out of it and we have no reference point to say that I was there for a long time or a short time. And there's no objective awareness. It's a non-objective state of meditation. And so that also is talked about in the Yoga Sutras, yes. In the states of samprajñata samadhi and asamprajñata samadhi, and the nirvitarka, nirvichara, and then the asamprajñata samadhi, especially in the asamprajñata samadhi, the samadhi where there is no positive knowledge. There one goes into it, and there is no vritti functioning of the mind. And the other samadhis, there is a vritti. It's just the same vritti rising again and again. So, okay, one more question here. Do we have time? If we have time for that.
Yeah, we actually we do have time.
Yes.
Do you distinguish between Prakriti and Maya?
Yes, distinguish between Prakriti and Maya. Now, in Sankhya and Yoga, they speak of Prakriti, and in Vedanta, we tend to speak of Maya, but sometimes we call Maya Prakriti. So from a Vedantic standpoint, then Prakriti means Maya, and Prakriti is not a separate eternal reality in itself. Its reality comes from the Brahman itself. Brahman is the only reality, and Prakriti is an appearance. But in Sankhya and Yoga, Prakriti, they're talking about the same thing, all that seems objective. But the distinction is that in Sankhya and in Yoga, they say that is eternal, it's real objectively. Prakriti never disappears, and Prakriti is objectively real. There's nothing unreal about it. It's not just an appearance. There's the actual stuff called Prakriti, which evolves into grosser and grosser stuff, which becomes all that we see. So it's a distinction. It's from the Vedantic standpoint, there is no distinction. From the yogic standpoint, there is, because Prakriti is real in itself.
So Maya has more of a pejorative connotation?
It can, but as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, there's Vidya Maya and there's Avidya Maya. There's the Maya of knowledge and wisdom and the Maya of ignorance. And so there was a saint at Dakshineshwar during the life of Ramakrishna, who Ramakrishna praised. He would come out of his cell in the evening. He would stay in his cell meditating all day, and he'd come out in the evening and dance and sing and say, "Oh, Divine Mother, how wonderful is your Maya." And so you find in the Advaitic texts that often Maya is used pejoratively. It's what we're supposed to avoid and everything. But other times it's the mysterious, magical power of Brahman, that which makes the impossible possible. Aghatana ghatana patiyasi, that which couldn't happen makes it happen. And so Maya, as what we're trying to transcend, it takes on a pejorative nature. But Sri Ramakrishna always said that Maya is the Divine Mother herself, and the Divine Mother is real, and that the Divine Mother is the Mother. So in that sense, it's not a pejorative at all. It's the appearance of the reality itself as the Divine Mother. So I'll stop. I think I'll stop here.
We have
Oh, you have more time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, any other, so here's a question right there, Swami, right
Okay,
beside
hold
you.
on a second. There you go.
Oh, it's working now. Good.
That other batteries need to be changed. You just hand it down.
Hello?
Yeah, it's
Need to be
working.
turned on. It's green. Hello?
It's working.
I can talk loud.
No,
It's working, it's
Put it
working.
up to your mouth,
Okay.
yeah, just put it up close to your mouth.
Okay. So what I just heard, and this is just the power of semantics. If Maya is that which is unreal, and then Mother is Maya, so she's both unreal and real.
A good question. Now, if I said it, I was mistaken. I should not have said, and I don't think I said that Maya is unreal. Maya is...
You didn't say it, but I've heard it said before, so that I wasn't putting those words.
Okay.
I've heard that spoken before,
Yes,
so that's the
That's often
context.
said,
Okay.
but actually in Vedanta it's said that Maya is neither real nor unreal. It can't be said to be unreal because we experience it. We're experiencing it right now, so how can I say it's unreal because I experience it? And yet it can't be said to be real because there's a state in which it disappears completely. And so when we speak of Maya as the Divine Mother is reality itself, but she is reality as seen through Maya. That she appears as the power of Brahman to a worshipper of Shiva. To worship Shiva, Shiva is identified with Brahman, Shiva is the reality. And all of this is maybe just the dance of Shiva, or it's illusion or whatever, depending on the school of thought. But for a worshipper of the Divine Mother is reality herself. Kali is reality itself. So Kali is Brahman, and Kali is this world. So Kali never becomes unreal. It's just whether we see Kali in her relative aspect or in her real nirguna absolute aspect, which never disappears. But Kali has the appearance, Kali is both with the transcendent and also the relative. And so it's not that Kali is unreal.
Okay.
And so in that sense, Kali as Maya is not, in that sense, is also not unreal. Maya refers to the manifestation, the appearance of the reality in name and form, but that name and form doesn't have any real substance to it. It disappears into consciousness itself, and so that's why it's neither real nor unreal.
And then earlier in the context of this conversation, it was discussed about jnana yoga, or someone who identifies themselves as a jnani,
Yeah.
and how difficult that path is considered to be. There seems to be that it could also be sort of a trap to think you're one thing. In that, oh, you're just the jnani versus these other aspects. To me, it's the mind playing tricks on itself to believe that as well.
Well, let me say this, that can be true of any path. That can be true of any path. And I wouldn't say that the path of knowledge is the harder path. It depends on the person. Like Sri Ramakrishna often said, that the devotion is the easy path. Swami Vivekananda also said that devotion is the easy path. What they had to mean, because otherwise it contradicts all of their larger teachings, what they had to mean was the majority of people will find that the path of devotion is easier because it is more in consonance with their nature. But there's some people for whom the path of devotion is impossible. Right? They have no interest in it, and no desire to follow it, and the path of knowledge is easier for them than the path of devotion. So whenever we talk about one path being easier than another, we have to be careful.
Relative to that mind body.
Relative to a particular person, it's easier or harder. And so there's nothing inherently harder about the path of knowledge. It's just there are probably fewer people numerically who have the temperament for it.
What you did discuss about the strength of the mind, the chitta.
Yes.
The strength. Could you elaborate a bit more on that kind of strength and that it's a discernment power is how I'm perceiving your words.
Yes. Yes, and I did say that many people following the path of knowledge find that it is difficult because they don't have the strength of mind to sit with that idea of changing their identity. And so yoga gives you a graduated approach towards that. And so that again is for many people that will be true. And so the problem from that standpoint, with the difficulty in jnana yoga from that standpoint is that if you're told that all you have to do is to know who you are, to give up the belief that you are the body and mind, and know that you are pure consciousness. For one thing, many people are not good at abstract thinking, and that's just way beyond anything that they can hold on to. Not because it's inherently difficult to hold on to, it's because people don't have the power for abstract thinking and to hold on to a more or less abstract idea. What a person following the path of jnana needs to be able to hold on to it well from the beginning is the ability to take an abstraction as a reality, that this is something I can hold on to, not physically as I'm showing in my hand, but mentally it's something I can grasp, and I can hold on to it, I can stick with it. And so yoga, Raja Yoga, is one way of strengthening the mind gradually so that the mind becomes more capable of finer perception, through clarifying the mind, through controlling the mind, so that when I hear an abstraction, I can see the practicality in the abstraction. Otherwise, it's just words, and it doesn't grasp me.
And how does an aspirant?
And then after that, let me go back here because there's questions back here. So
how does an aspirant, in this context of maintaining that clarity? I just feel like the mind can keep tricking the mind.
And the mind can keep tricking the mind.
The purification process, I understand that, but as long as you're in a mind body, you're still dealing with the relative mind, materially. Yes.
And so the mind does, here you can take it back there and as I answer. The mind does play tricks, and so that we have to be careful. There's no substitute in spiritual life for sincerity, no substitute at all. And even if we're sincere, we find that the mind plays tricks on us. But to the degree that we are sincere, as Sri Ramakrishna said, if you really want to go from here to Los Angeles, and of course he said Puri instead of Los Angeles, but you want to go to, imagine the days when there were no freeways, and so you just have local roads to go from here to Los Angeles. If you sit in your room thinking that, well, I don't know how to get there, how am I going to go? You're never going to get there just thinking about how you don't know how to go. But if you set out and say, no, I'm going to go, I'm going to find my way, and you go out and start asking, maybe somebody tells you the wrong way, you end up in Tijuana, and then you realize, oh, you ask somebody else. Eventually, by doing it, you find your way there, but it's because you sincerely want to go. And so in spiritual life, there's no substitute for sincerity. And that's also the part that a teacher can play. Having a teacher, a guru, a master, such a person, if they're qualified, they can see when we're fooling ourselves when we don't see it. So yes.
Thank you, Swamiji. If Jnana Yoga is a cognitive shift where you're seeing from the perspective of Atma, the self, then is the role of Raja Yoga to help you calm the mind so that you can assimilate those teachings, you can apply them in everyday life?
Yes, that's why Raja Yoga helps. Now again, from the pure standpoint of just pure Jnana Yoga, not mixing it with Raja Yoga practices and all of that, but just pure Jnana Yoga, the approach to the mind is what? The approach is, I'm not the mind. And Swami Vivekananda taught that, not exclusively, because he laid a lot of emphasis in his teachings in America on Raja Yoga. But he also taught the other. And he says in one of his beautiful lectures given here in California, he says, so what if the mind runs on? Let it run on, I'm not the mind. So that's the pure jnana standpoint, that who cares whether the mind is controlled or uncontrolled, I'm not the mind. So let me just take my stand on consciousness and forget about the mind. But again, that's difficult to do. And so Raja Yoga helps to bring enough calmness to the mind where we can do some of these other practices more easily for most of us. There's a question here, and then
Carolyn.
Yeah, and then we'll come over here if there's time.
Till 1 o'clock.
Till 1 o'clock. Oh, okay, we've got plenty of time.
Thank you, Swami. Just for clarification with terms, because I'm just getting confused because my mind is like in yoga terms, and when you say mind, do you mean chitta? And when you say consciousness, you're saying pure consciousness sometimes, you're saying consciousness, so I'm not sure when you're talking purusha, when you're talking chitta. You know what I mean?
Well, consciousness, unless it's obvious from the context, where I'm talking about the conscious mind. But when I say consciousness, I mean pure consciousness. I'm talking about, whenever I say, when I talk about just consciousness without saying that, in the West, consciousness means the conscious processes. Otherwise, when I say consciousness, I mean chit, pure consciousness. which is the nature of Purusha, yeah. So consciousness, I mean just pure consciousness, not processes of consciousness, not consciousness being aware of things, but consciousness in itself, which is the nature of the Purusha.
Okay, so when you're going to talk about chitta, meaning the three parts of consciousness?
There are four parts,
what-
say yes. The four parts, say yes, yes, yes.
Then you're going to tell us some other
Yes.
ways.
And so when I'm talking now about mind, I'm using it in a very general sense. That's a good question. But for most people, when I talk about mind, they're just understanding mind as we ordinarily think of it. But the mind, as I'm speaking of it, is sometimes I'm speaking about manas, and sometimes I'm speaking about buddhi. Because when the mind becomes perfectly still, you're talking about buddhi. The lower mind doesn't become perfectly still. It merges into buddhi to become still. And so it's in the buddhi that perfect stillness of mind is attained. Later I'll get into a discussion of this because it's a technical discussion, valuable, important, but a technical discussion. But what she's asking about is there are different parts to the mind. One part is the manas. It's called, in Sanskrit, it's called manas, M-A-N-A-S, and that means the lower part of the mind which coordinates sense information. I see you, I hear your questions, I feel my surroundings, there's a sense of smell, all of these different senses. Sight is so different from sound. Sound is so different from smell. Smell is so different from taste. Well, taste and smell are close together. But then the sense, the tactile sense, they're vastly different realms of experience. And yet it's the manas which takes in sights, sounds, tactile sense, smells, tastes, and puts it into a comprehensible world, a cosmos. Without the manas, I just have colors, sounds, all these different types of information which is completely uncoordinated, and there's just a chaos. And that's somewhat the experience of a newborn baby. The newborn baby looks out in surprise and sees this world, but it's just a world of sensation, not yet coordinated. The baby has within it the potential power to coordinate all that, but it hasn't developed yet. It's still forming. And so it just sees an ocean of sensations. But I see a comprehensible universe because the manas makes sense out of it. But then the buddhi is the higher part of the mind. And then the citta is sometimes in yoga, citta is, as Swami Vivekananda translates it, the mind stuff, the basic stuff of the mind. And the citta takes on the form of buddhi, takes on the form of manas, and takes on the form of ahankara. So that's where she said the three parts of mind. And I said there are four parts because we can separate out the citta as a part in itself. Though it's the citta in the yoga system, the citta which takes on the functions of, it's the basic stuff of the mind which takes on the functions of manas, buddhi, and ahankara. So, is your hand raised, Botadar?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Oh, get the microphone to him so that it's...
Yours first.
All right. Oh, she had a question. Oh, I didn't ask. Well, you've already asked one. He hasn't asked one yet. Oh, you didn't ask one? Oh, I thought you had asked. I'm sorry. Okay.
What?
Oh, that was in front of you. Yes, the lady in front of you who asked.
My
Go
question
ahead.
is, in all spiritual and religious traditions, there is a practice.
Speak into the microphone. You have to put it close to your mouth.
Okay.
Like this.
Yeah, in all spiritual and religious traditions, there is a path, a practice, and a goal. At the same time, I've also heard, in fact, Ramana Maharshi says in his book that meditation or reciting a mantra or can be helpful, but you still need grace. He uses the word arul, which in Tamil it means grace. And I've also read in many articles that you keep practicing, but you need grace. And in the Vaishnava tradition, they say don't aspire for kaivalya. You should ask for moksha. Paramapada is the final thing. But then you need the grace of Narayana, to take you there. So now we have had examples of Ashoka and Valmiki, and they didn't do anything. They were cruel or thieves or robbers, whatever, but they had the grace. So now, what is my the practice itself? I'm very happy with the practice. It's giving me a lot of joy and engagement. Sometimes I feel I have kaivalya because there's a cosmos joy in the practice. But then what does it mean then I need grace. Don't I at least get to the top of the line for grace? Or
Yes. Well, no, grace, the spiritual life can be seen from the standpoint of grace. And in fact, in the Upanishads, in the Katha Upanishad, it says that the self is chosen only by the one who the self chooses. That it's only through the grace of the self that one realizes the self. And the idea behind that idea of grace is that the limited ego, which is what is doing spiritual practice, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to discriminate, I'm going to be dispassionate, I'm going to sit for meditation, I'm going to do puja, that's the limited ego. And the limited ego can never attain to the infinite because it's limited in all of its actions. And so at some point, the infinite has to reveal itself. And so in yoga, they don't talk much about grace. There is the idea of surrender to God, because they have the idea of God, as I said, in the yoga system, but they don't talk much of grace as a factor. But that's because the problem with grace is, because there is a problem with grace, and the problem with grace is that you get it or you don't get it. And if I don't get it, what do I do? Do I just sit around and say, when am I going to get grace, when am I going to get grace? So no, yoga says, do this. And it doesn't talk about the coming of grace, but as Sri Ramakrishna said, that if you unfurl your sail, the breeze of God's grace is always blowing and it will come. And so the grace of the infinite, whether it's God or the self, is real. And that at some point has to take over because again, the ego can only do so much, set the stage, but then the grace has to come to reveal the infinite, because the finite cannot grasp the infinite. So the final step of spiritual life is when the infinite reveals itself. The Avadhuta Gita, a text of uncompromising non-dualism, begins. The first half of the very first verse of the Avadhuta Gita is Ishwaranugrahadeva pumsam advaita vasana. Only through the grace of God does one attain to the desire for non-dualism. There's no further mention of God in the Avadhuta Gita. It says only through the grace of God does one attain to the desire for non-dualism. And so grace is there. Grace is a reality. Yoga doesn't speak in terms of grace because it's speaking in terms of what you can do. And as Swami Vivekananda said, that if we have understood where we're going, then we can put all of our effort into the means of going there. We don't have to keep thinking about the goal, and when am I going to get there? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? No. Put your emphasis in. And so that's the yoga approach, is do the practice which is here. And the other things will happen of themselves, which means the grace of God. The devotional practice is different, and that's why it's important not to mix all of these things up. They can be blended, but we have to blend them consciously and not project Vaishnava ideas of the devotional path onto the yoga path, because that doesn't work. They're coming from different standpoints. And so the Vaishnava or the devotional tradition puts huge emphasis on grace, because grace is a reality. And everything can be removed by grace. Obstacles can be removed by grace. Illumination can come through grace. But we can also sit for our whole lives waiting for grace, and we're just sitting there. And so yoga doesn't even address that problem. It says, do this. And so that's why grace is not developed as a part of the path in yoga.
Last question, Swami.
Okay, last question.
David,
oh, yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Do you think there is a common goal for Raja Yoga and Patanjali Yoga and Dhyana Yoga? In order, for example, in Dhyana Yoga to shift the identity, you have to admit that Aham Brahmasmi and to kill the ego. And in Patanjali Yoga, Viveka Kyati, to separate the buddhi, which is also the ego, from the Purusha. Is that in this way the common goal?
That's the common goal of both. But let me say one refinement on that. You're right, Gojadai. That's a very good point. And that is the common goal between the two. But the question comes, and a question about the very heights. We don't need to worry about that because we're not there. But at the very heights of illumination, why was it that the Sankhya philosophers and saints of the Sankhya system and the yoga saints, the sages of the yoga system like Patanjali, that they got to the point where they realized the Purusha, realized infinite consciousness, and that they were the infinite consciousness, but they didn't come to the idea that I am reality itself. They still had the idea that there is Prakriti that no longer pertains to me because I've separated myself. Kaivalya, I'm free from Prakriti, but Prakriti is still there. And then there are all these infinite other number of Purushas there. why did they not get to the realization of non-dualism? Of course, a yogi would say because non-dualism is false, that the yogis attain to the highest. But a non-dualist would say that the highest realization comes through knowledge, and that knowledge has to come from somewhere. And so that's why they put so much emphasis in the Advaita tradition on the Tattvamasi, thou art that, which you know well, Aham Brahmasmi, Prajnanam Brahma, Soyam Atma Brahma, that I am the reality, infinite reality itself. Because when that idea comes, then the final illusion goes. And then you realize that, no, I'm not just the infinite Purusha, I am the reality, the Purusha. There's nothing else outside of me. There's no Prakriti that's outside of me. Everything was just an appearance within this infinite reality which I am. And not me as separate from you, but me who is you, who am you, and who is everything else, or whatever the grammar is. And so, from a non-dualistic Vedanta standpoint, there's like the sage Patanjali and the great Sankhya philosophers, they attain to practically the highest. But the Advaitin would say there's one step left, and that's because that knowledge has to come in the form of an instruction that you are that reality. But otherwise, for practical purposes, there's no difference. For practical purposes, the yoga and the Advaita Vedanta, that's the point of meeting, where you realize infinite consciousness. So, okay, that's the last thing. Okay.